attention immediately, and I went into it, and well, this is the third time we have you here at the conference, and every year has been a success. And there's been a huge request to have you back next year. And we had the pleasure yesterday to see one of the projects inspired by your work here in Aarhus, and we went out visiting a family and spoke with the people in the project. And it is just really fascinating and so inspiring. And I'm just so anxious to learn about the new stuff that's been going on and the new book, which is my summer reading.
Yes, and it's being translated later in the year into Danish. How can you pronounce this, Jakob?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here again. Thank you so much for inviting me. I love coming. Yesterday was a really inspiring day to see the work in the communities, and perhaps we can talk a bit about that later. And it's really an honor to follow Ken and to kind of to meet you and to pick up on your work. I'm really happy to be here. Can you hear me at the back? Would you wave at me? Oh yes, especially Rasmus. I know you won't be shy. Will you wave at me if you can't hear me? Because this is
It's working at all.
Is it working at all? Okay. You can't hear me in the front? No, okay. Oh really? The thing is, my head is too small to put it on my head. So it shows that in life, even with a brain the size of a pea, you can kind of get somewhere and you can do things, which is great. So anyway, I'm very happy. So over the last couple of years, I've been coming and I've been telling stories about the work that I've been doing, actually mainly in communities in Britain, but also in other places in the world. But this year, Jakob asked me to talk a bit more about, at the level of ideas, about the kind of operating framework, if you like, that is surrounding the work that I do. So I'm going to kind of talk a bit more at that level. Because I think we see increasingly, I mean, every year with more intensity, a questioning about the viability of our welfare systems here in the Western world. And actually, Ken just said that the whole way of life in the Western world is kind of, under pressure. And there are real pressures from changing demographics. We're aging, which is a wonderful thing, but also creates new challenges, immigration, the rapid and deep effects of a transition into a new digital economy, the pressures of living on a fragile planet. And this is creating kind of very big debate, I think an increasingly divisive politics, and also this kind of nervousness about perceived financial constraints. Our colleague here from Trondheim was talking about how everybody feels overwhelmed and that there's not enough to go around. And I think that's a really common feeling. And so increasingly, I think that more and more of us, whether we're activists, politicians, community workers, scholars, we feel that the systems we're working in aren't helping us, that we're trying to do work in spite of the system rather than kind of in the flow of organizations that are set up to help us work in the way we want to work. And I think actually that many of us have a kind of sneaking suspicion, not just that we're working in spite of the systems, but actually these systems might be creating more problems than they're solving. And that really we're kind of in quite a difficult place. Is it very difficult when I move my head up and down? Is it a bit crazy? How is the sound? Am I doing okay? All right, I'll stop worrying about it, thank you. So I think, what should we do? There are kind of two broad arguments. And on the one side, we have people who say, look, if we just put more money and more resource into those systems, everything would be okay. It's just a question of resource. And on the other side, we have people who say, it's about reorganizing the systems. It's about managing better. If we just measured more, if we kind of did better reorganization, better management, if we worked, in this way, if we just kind of got the silos to work together, everything would be okay. And actually, I don't think either of those arguments are right. I think that probably the troubles we face are much deeper than that. But I also think the possibilities we have are very, very much bigger. And I think we need to start talking, thinking, acting differently. We need to tell different stories, and we really need to create something new for this century. So that's why I wrote the book, Radical Help. Radical Help is actually, I wrote it for the general public. One of the things I think is that we need a very different public debate if we're going to kind of empower our leaders and our politicians to make change. We can't just keep looking up like children, hoping that somebody up there with more authority than us is going to make change. We're going to have to make the change. And so I wrote a book to see if I could kind of put a little pebble in the lake and be part of a different conversation, one that starts with possibility. So I'm a social activist. I started out 3 decades ago working in communities in Africa and Latin America. I started out working with the guerrilla army, then I worked with a very big international NGO, and then finally I ended up at the World Bank. And in all of these institutions, what I saw was very well-intentioned people, who I learned a lot from, very well-intentioned programs, always trying to change the lives of other people. But none of these programs ever seemed to work. And what I saw again and again was that the culture and the rules of the organizations always seemed to trip up whatever the program was. And I also saw that even though something often sounded very brilliant in a report or kind of on the desk of a manager, that once it kind of met reality in the community, it somehow didn't have the effect it was supposed to have. Again, it didn't really work. So I had this growing conviction that I needed to work in a different way, and that I didn't really have the tools or the knowledge or the methods that I wanted to make change, and I was probably more part of the problem than kind of actually making any change. So I realized that I needed, like many kind of reformers and activists before me, that I needed to start again, and I needed to kind of go and live different realities and walk in other people's shoes and understand things in a different way. And so 30 years ago, I moved to a barrio. What would you call it? You'd call it the ghetto, although yesterday we saw something of a different kind of ghetto. But I moved to basically a slum of about 40,000 people in the Dominican Republic who live in a network of open sewers. With no agenda, I just went there one day. It's beneath the suspension bridges of the city and said, you know, can I come and live here? And everybody was very kind, and they took me into their lives. And I spent a long time just listening, watching as other people came to do the work, and slowly beginning to develop new methods and new approaches that I use today, and in fact have been using over the last 10 years for work in Britain. And these approaches don't ever start by saying, how can we fix this service? How can we improve this institution? They start actually by spending time with people in their lives and saying, you know, what's important to you? What would you like to change? What could I do beside you to help you take that next step of change? So it's a very different perspective from the perspective of going into a community and asking questions, but still really with the kind of questions posed from the service saying, how can I improve my service? And so I get to meet people like Kate in Britain. Kate lives not far from me, and she's unwell. She's in pain. She's overweight. She has diabetes. She has many kind of health complaints. She can't walk well enough to get on a bus anymore. She can't reach up to wash her hair in the shower. And she has 9 specialist doctors. And her whole life really is about meeting these doctors who are trying to take care of her and making those appointments. And in England, we call patients like Kate, the doctors call her their heart sink patients. So when the patient like Kate walks into the clinic, basically their hearts sink because they don't really have a cure. They don't know what they're going to do. They have 10 minutes to kind of talk to the patient and try and figure something out, but it's really not going to work. And so I invited Kate's 9 doctors to meet with me. And they told me something that Kate already knows, which is that the drugs don't work. Really, the doctors don't have much purpose in her life. But what they know that what Kate needs is something completely different that doesn't exist. She needs a kind of network of relationships in her community, with peers. She still needs the professionals, but in a different kind of setup. And she really needs radical help to change the way that she lives. But that help isn't available, so they kind of keep managing the problem because there's nowhere else to take care of Kate. And I also spend time with young people. I'm always kind of seeking new conversations. So part of the work I talk about in the book was that I rented a bus for a while, and I stacked it up with pizza, and on Friday nights I took the bus to places in London and also seaside towns. We have this thing in Britain where we've shipped families that we think are problem families to towns in the south of England on the coast. So these have become, in a way, whole kind of ghetto towns that have amazing hearts. Some of them are amazing. We were in Brighton. Some of them are like Brighton, but also around these vibrant hearts of the city are places where we've sent people to live where there's no work. And so I parked up in the kind of these neighborhoods, And I spent time on rough ground in youth centres, and I kind of met gang members like Melvin, who's kind of in a lot of trouble. I met young people like Mo, who he's just lost, he's failing his exams, he doesn't know what to do with his life. But I also met people like Ben, who wants to be a chef, or a 14-year-old called Amelia, who wanted to write. And even though some of the young people had real determination of what they wanted to do with their lives, they didn't have the connections. They knew that they needed to know somebody to get on and make the next step, but they had no possible way of doing this. They had nowhere to turn. And none of these young people told me they wanted better youth services. They didn't want more youth-only spaces. What they wanted was a way to become connected into a community, into a different part of the town that was kind of on the side to where they lived, and to make those new connections. And I think the other thing that's really important is that I spend a lot of time with the amazing professionals who work in the British welfare services, although recently I've been in Norway as well, which has been a really wonderful experience. And so I'm spending time with teachers, with nurses, with doctors, carers, social workers. And what I see again and again is professionals who are utterly committed to their work, but as I said, really exhausted from trying to do things within systems where there doesn't seem to be enough resource, where the rules and the boundaries seem to be trying to tell you to do, it's a bit like the diagram here, telling you to do the very opposite of what you kind of think that you need to do as a professional. So we end up with lots of people who are well taken care of, perhaps in our society, definitely here in Denmark, well taken care of, but their lives aren't actually changing. And I think this is the problem, that our welfare state, which was completely brilliant when it was started, was designed for a very different era, a very different economy, and it can't work today. And I think that all across the world, even if kind of services may look different in the UK or the US or Denmark, all of us are working with a similar 20th century mindset. And I think that mindset doesn't really help us today. And I could say a lot about that, but I think one of the most important things is that there's this unspoken idea in this mindset that trouble or problems are kind of this temporary kind of break or aberration in a smooth life path. So if we think of employment, we have this idea, oh, and this is how the services were designed. Here's this one individual, unfortunately at the moment they can't find work. How can we deal with this kind of disruption in an idea of a stable life pattern, get them back into work and everything will be okay again? But this isn't the 21st century. The 21st century is continual disruption, continual change. We can't kind of wait for the kind of frozen moment of data and then think we can create another stable moment that will continue. We have to kind of find new ways to work with these tides and in this continual change. And I think that we don't have the kind of mindsets or the institutions, probably, I don't know, I'm quite old, but so maybe younger people it's different, but people of my generation, we weren't trained in the way to kind of think of these problems in this way. So that's what radical help and what I've called relational welfare is about. And I thought that today I want to talk very kind of briefly, I don't know how I'm doing, about three things. So the first thing would be why I think that we can't just reform and reorganize our existing systems. I think they're broken and they need to be changed. The second is about what we could actually do differently. And then thirdly, very briefly, I just want to kind of talk a bit about how we could then transition from what we have now to where we would all like to be. So I think that there are three reasons why we can't reform our existing institutions. And the first one is that we face new problems, problems that I've mentioned, like loneliness, like a different aging demographic, like problems of the environment, and problems that Kate suffers from chronic disease rather than the infectious diseases that our health systems were set up to deal with. And I think what's important is not just that not all of these problems were foreseen when our welfare systems were designed. It's that they're very different in nature. So they need a very different type of response. So if we take young people, for instance, I mean, the idea of adolescence, I mean, our British welfare state was designed after the war, 1950s. There was not a concept of adolescence, and we knew very little about it. But now we know that these kind of in-between years, let's say 14 to 24, are really important developmentally. We know that we're making all these kind of new neural connections, we're developing socially. We also know that if something went wrong when we were very small, that then in these in-between years we can kind of reset the path and we can grow again. So what should we do? If we kind of think about the silos of our welfare state, young people aren't really in there. They're a kind of add-on maybe with youth services later. We need to kind of rethink about what would happen in a kind of 21st century. How would we ensure that every young person finds their place in the world, and what would that look like? Or if we take health, like I say, Kate is suffering from chronic disease. This is a kind of global challenge. All over the world, we have citizens who suffer. I mean, in Britain, 1 in 4 of us has a chronic condition, and we have a health system that is set up totally around infectious disease. And in Britain, 70% of our health expenditure is going on patients with chronic diseases who are in the medical system. But not one single one of these patients can be cured. As I say, like Kate, they need a completely different system, but we don't have that different system. So that's why I say that no amount of reorganization is going to help this. The common factor to all the challenges of this century, whether it is loneliness or chronic disease or living a flourishing life when you're older, is about human connection. That we have everything organized like this, and the common thing about living well in this century is that we need to kind of organize in this way, with peers, with communities, with professionals, in a very horizontal way. So we have these systems that are like, as Ken was saying, I talk about industrial conveyor belts, and in fact our health systems are a perfect example. It's like it is just an industrial process. You line up, you're put in a bed, you're moved along the process, you're cured, you die, and then you're out the other end. But as I say, if we're living half our lives with a chronic condition, this isn't working. So that's the first challenge, really, how to kind of move these very kind of vertical systems to kind of horizontal networks, because participation is the key to solving the problems of this century, I think. And the second challenge is about social and economic structures. So I conceive of our welfare states as a kind of mirror image of mass industrial production. I mean, they were really designed and improved in order to make sure that as citizens we could kind of find our way in these mass industrial systems. But of course that world's gone. So most welfare systems are built on the idea that women will care for free. The idea that the wife will be at home, she'll take care of the husband, the children, the parents, if necessary, the neighbours. Now, of course, in Denmark, you have a system of universal childcare that is the envy of the whole world. We don't have that in Britain. And none of us really have a good idea about how to care across generations, how to care for young children and our beloved parents as well at the same time. So we have a huge challenge of how to care. And we also have a problem of work, because as I've said, the sort of stable idea for life. When I was here last year, I talked about how we have these kind of labour systems which are about money and advice to get back into a job, with the idea that once you've got a job, somehow you'll just stay there. When most of us can expect about 8 jobs in our life, over half of us will never have a formal employer. So we've got this complete disconnect between the modern digital economy, artificial intelligence, biotech, the kind of demands and way that that's working, and the kind of systems that are set up to support us. And the third, I think the most profound reason that our welfare systems can't work is about poverty. Because poverty has not gone away, which was definitely what the founders of our welfare systems expected to happen. In fact, it's growing. And also, I think very importantly, it's changing shape. So here in Denmark, you don't have the extreme poverty we have in Britain. Last year in Britain, we had a new category of poverty indicators added in 2017 to the poverty data we have. We had a new category called destitution. So I think we're the 5th biggest economy in the world, and we have this new category. There are 1.25 million people in Britain today. I can't remember how many children, but that includes hundreds of thousands of children who have no bed for the night, can't be sure of a meal or keeping clean and warm. So, in a very developed economy. Now, of course, Denmark is different. You don't have this extreme poverty. But I think looking at the indicators, your poverty has doubled. You have people that are still in the system. And you do also have kind of a growing challenge of child poverty. And I think this is also we have to see this as a structural challenge, that the digital economy is widening the gaps between us. There are the people who earn the kind of dizzying sums of high finance with algorithms and everything else, and then there are those of us who are still trying to do the kind of work of care, for example, traditional work. And this is very divisive. What begins to happen is you have conversations amongst wealthy people who say, well, why do we have these welfare systems? Like, really, why are we spending all this money? And, what are we doing? Because as our incomes become more divided, we know each other less and less. Less and less we live in the same places. We go, not to the same schools. We don't join the same things together. Basically, we don't know each other as well. And so this really matters because so much research shows that it's our relationships that will count. It's our relationships that will determine what work we find, how healthy we'll be, who takes good care of us in the end. And as I've said, it's about social connection that can address our modern challenges, and yet at the same time, those relationships are becoming increasingly frayed. So I think that our welfare state can still kind of grip us in times of crisis. We can kind of get, that we can get in those nets. But what it can't be is like a trampoline that can really enable us to kind of make that change, propel us forward, and think about how we could kind of make change in our lives. So the next question then is, well, fine, what can we do? And many of you know that I've spent the last 10 years in Britain asking this question. I've been working with homes and communities, and from the ground up, I've been building new forms of welfare as social enterprises, which many thousands of people have used over the last 10 years to try and show these are working exemplars of a different system. This is how it can work. In fact, it costs less money. It benefits more. This is how it can work. So I've been working with families who are locked out of the system. I've been working with older people, young people, in health systems and with labour systems. And I wasn't going to talk about the family work because I've come here and talked about the family work I've done before. But because yesterday the work touched so closely, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes just to kind of go into that work and show it. So we work with families who are in a state of distress, really. They have all kinds of problems. Lack of work, violence, drugs, children on child protection register or removed. Most of the mothers I work with have 2 mobile phones. One of them they use to manage what they call the social. They mean the welfare state because they're so scared their children will be taken away. And the other number they use to kind of have relationships with a very small set. They're usually locked out of society, but a small set of family and friends. And so we were asked by a municipality. They said, we've got these families. They cost us a lot of money. We've tried everything to change the lives of these families. What can you do to help us? And so I work with a capability approach, and I can talk a bit more about that later, but they actually said, well, we've heard about the capability approach. Do you think that can really work with families that are so locked out of society that for maybe 1 or 2 generations haven't worked, whose children are excluded from school? And as I say, the problems they're facing are very wide. So we rented a house on the housing estate. What would you call this? Like the neighbourhood where the families were living. And for 6 months, we just lived alongside 12 families. And we are actually the experience where, the family, one of the women I write about in my book called Ella, where she does have 73 different workers in the life of her and her family, working out of 28 departments, all trying to kind of, tick the boxes and do what their department is asking them to do. So we see this is actually Ella's family. We see all of these different people coming in. When we move into the estate, we're there, we're sitting on the sofa when the social workers come to call, when the police officers come to call, we're out looking for the children after dark, we're there when the neighbours get really angry because the kind of level of shouting and the kind of music is so loud next door. So we're there, we're kind of experiencing the crisis, and we're experiencing what it feels like to be on the receiving end of what they call the social. And then we also spend time, because I work in a kind of very ethnographic way, with social workers. So this is a graphic that shows the life of Ryan, who is the social worker for Ella's 12-year-old son, Tom. And so we're there just kind of watching what happens. And what we see is that Tom, the social worker, spends 74% of his time, this bit here, in meetings. He spends it on the system. So he spends it kind of filling out forms, in meetings with his colleagues, basically kind of doing the work of the bureaucracy. He spends 12% of his time talking to other agencies. So in fact, they're trying to kind of remove Ryan from the family home and send him to a school for troubled boys, so he's kind of liaising with the school and trying to find a place for Tom in the school. And then he has 14% of his time Ryan and Tom can spend together. And actually, it's when I sit in that meeting that I see how bad the problem is. Because Ryan is an amazing social worker, and actually he's really brilliant with young people. But when he is with Tom, he needs information for his forms. So even that time that they spend together isn't really time spent building a relationship. It's actually time, I would say that it's degenerative time, to borrow your language, Ken. Because, Ryan is there and he's like, okay, have you been smoking? Have you done your homework? How much have you been drinking this week? And, kind of Tommy's a teenager, so he's feeling very sulky and he's kind of picking at a scab on his arm or looking at his trainers and really not participating at all. So this time that could be a relationship, the beginning of a relationship, the beginning of a bond that would be needed to make change in Tom's life, actually just serves to drive them further and further apart. And in fact, at the end of the day, Ryan is pretty fed up. He said to me, on this particular day, I didn't train for this. I'm really fed up. I don't really want to stay in the system. And most of our public service systems have 1/3 vacancy rates in Britain because the work is just impossible to do within the constraints of the system. So we invited everybody together. Everybody was in the lives of this family, the police, the social workers, the medical services. We invited the leaders all together. And we began to plot round the walls of the room every intervention, which started in 1980, kind of quite slowly at first, and then as children were born and the children got into trouble, we had more and more interventions around the wall. And when everybody could see this picture together, not just the work they'd been doing as a police officer or as a social worker or as a kind of youth worker, there was this moment of breakdown of, my goodness, we can't believe we've all been involved in this and no change has happened. And that was the moment at which we were able to kind of begin to create different work, which we started in one city called Swindon, and we've taken to 4 other cities in Britain. And so there was this story, you see, in Britain, that we spend £250,000, I don't know what's that, how many kroner is that on each family? 2.5 million every year on these families. And what we said was, actually, you don't spend a single penny on these families. What you do is you spend on this system that keeps these families locked, spinning exactly where they are. What we'd like to do is actually spend some of that money on change. And so we said to the families, we asked everybody who worked around these families to step back. And we said to the families, who would you like to help you make change? And we began to interview the families. I can't tell the whole story today, but I've given a TED talk where I talk about the process of interviewing frontline workers. But the main thing was that almost every frontline worker, and this has been the same in every city we've gone to, wants to join us. Because what we say to the professionals is, we have got a system in which you will spend 80% of your time working alongside the families. Only 20% of your time will be spent running the system. And everybody trains for this. All of us want to make change and want to be there to help others. So people come because they want to kind of work in this new way. And then I just wanted to say, because this came up in conversation yesterday, is that we do have a program. It has 4 stages. So the first stage is we invite families to participate, which makes often the leaders very nervous. They're like, are you really going to get the most difficult, troubled families? But we do. And that change in conversation by not saying you're mandated to come, but asking. It can take 6 months of just visiting, keeping asking, and then the families come in. And then the first stage is making a plan. The families make a plan. Of course, there's millions of plans around these families. Every department has a plan. But now the families make a plan. Then we work to foster capability. And then the third stage is kind of leaving the program, re-engaging with the community. It takes an average of 2 years for a family to move through this program, but it isn't a kind of linear process. You go forwards, you go backwards. Often at the moment where you are most comfortable and ready to make change, you face up to the biggest difficulties and you will move backwards in that moment. So, but it provides a methodology. We use the capabilities of the methodology, and it provides a framework for doing the work. So I think I'm going to be out of time if I tell you the other experiences about young people and health that I was going to tell you. So maybe I'm going to skip those. Yes, I'm going to skip those, actually, and I'm going to talk about this new architecture. So I was going to tell you later in the workshops we can talk about how this works in health, how this works with young people. But basically, I've been testing over the last 10 years this new welfare framework. And it's kind of grown through practice, grown from the bottom up, and then been tested again and again, working in different places across Britain with different groups of people. And so this is what I propose that would make a difference, really. You will have your own, but just as an example, this is what I propose. So the first thing I think is really important is that we need a vision. And that vision, I think, has to be national and within a program. So when all the people join our family work, for example, the health people aren't trying to improve health, and the people in employment aren't trying to get people into work. The vision of the program is that this family will be able to flourish. And then this family will choose what flourishing looks like. And of course, actually, families want to work and they want their children in school, so all that gets worked out. But at no point do we say, we think really you should have a job, or we really think your children should be in school. And I think it's the same for us as a nation. So when our welfare systems were designed, there wasn't this idea of service. It wasn't all about how we could run services and make services more efficient. It was actually about how we were going to participate in flourishing social democracies. And it was thought, yes, of course it's important. You can only participate if you have good education, good health care. But instead, what's happened is that I think across the Western world, we've lost sight of the vision. And we're all focused on these narrow, linear models of service and how we can improve service delivery. Of course, we've had welfare reform. In Britain, we've had really intense welfare reform. But I think that we can't really call this welfare reform. I think what it's been is a kind of reorganisation and actually usually a privatisation of existing state models. And little money has been saved. In Britain, we have constant scandals about health care organisations or elder care organisations going bankrupt because they don't actually know how to run the models. But I think what has been less written about is how the effects of these market systems have really changed the cultural and human side of what is caring and what is welfare. Because our welfare services were always transactional. They were always based on this industrial pipeline model that Ken has also talked about. But I think introducing the market and all those mechanisms, I mean, not all of our services are private, but they have now the mindset of the market, which is about data, efficiency, innovation, measurement, you know, this constant kind of cycle. And in this, human relationships are overlooked because they can't be measured. So, I mean, an example I often talk about is we provide meals for older people in Britain. And in one place where we worked, they had to save money on the meals. So they find somebody much cheaper to provide the meals. Of course, the meals are cheaper because the person who used to spend time on the doorstep talking to the older person is not going to do that anymore. And the person who's in an office somewhere in a different city, just as Ken talked about, commissioning who's going to provide the meals, doesn't really see that. So they think, it's great, I've got this kind of cheaper service. But what we saw happening over time is less and less people use the service because actually the older person doesn't really want to eat that much. They're not that hungry anyway, and now there's nobody to chat to. There's no point in having the meal. So the service gets cheaper and cheaper, but actually, of course, all that cost falls somewhere else in a health service when the problems intensify from not eating well, from not having anybody to talk to. And we see this again and again. So in fact, what's happened is through the market, we have kind of driven out relationships. We say that if you want to see the same doctor, that's too expensive. If you want to have a kind of relationship with another person in your community, that's too risky because risk frameworks are really part of the market. And now it's all about managing risk, not making change. And if we want the community to solve something, we can't do that because we've got this bidding process, and then that wouldn't be fair if the community just kind of came and did this. So what we've grown in England really is this management state where 80% of the resource goes on managing, revolving in the system, and 20% on change. In fact, that's quite polite. I often see 96% on management and 4% on change, but I spend a lot of time talking to British politicians and persuading them of my way of looking, so I think 80-20 sounds a bit better. So I think that all of these shifts are important. And I think it's very much about taking them all together. We can't kind of pick off one or the other, although I haven't got time to kind of talk about them all. But I think the second one that is probably the most important is this shift because of the management state from managing need to developing capability. And that's the one that I just want to kind of talk about very, very quickly. So the capability approach, which was originally developed by the economist, Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, starts with this deceptively simple question which says, what can we really be or do? And, Sen, he studied, some of you probably know, he studied famines, and what he was really interested in is why do people starve when they're always close to food, which in our cases we could see, nobody's starving here in Denmark, but we could see it as a metaphor. Why, when people live in very flourishing places, are they not flourishing? So the question, I like the question what we can be and do because it takes account of the structural realities like do we have money, is there employment, what do our society look like? And it also takes into account the kind of internal realities of our world. So as I say, I kind of work with young people in very vibrant cities, but those young people aren't taking part because they can't connect and also because subtly they've been told again and again really that these opportunities are not for you. And it's the same with the mother that I just showed you. She lives right next door to a Honda car factory in her town, and there are jobs there. But really, a politician could say there's an opportunity in this city. There are all these jobs, great jobs in the Honda car factory. But the reality is, actually, that Ella, the mother, is never going to get a job when we meet her. She does, in fact, get a job. But when we meet her, she's not going to get a job in that car factory. She's not going to be able to perform an interview. She doesn't have the formal skills. She doesn't have the kind of connections. And she doesn't have the kind of soft skills either that would enable her to get a job. So this framing of internal and external is one of the reasons that I like the capability approach. And the other one is because it addresses power head on. So the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who's also talked about this approach, says that too much of our social policy is made by elites, and it's framed by elites, and then when it hits the ground, it's different. And I think, as I said at the beginning, that is my experience. But the capability approach doesn't tell you what's important. It doesn't say, these are the goals of my agency or my organisation, we've got to find a way to meet them. It says, what's important to you? What opportunities do you really have? What can you really be and do? Let's start there. And so we work with 4 capabilities. I mean, the framework's more complex, but because I want to be able to kind of grow the work for many thousands, and because we don't have much money, we focus on 4. So we say the good life in Britain is about, I don't know what's happened in the middle of that slide, but we say the good life in Britain is about working and learning, by which I mean the capability for inquiry, for rich discussion. I don't mean the exam factories that we have that Ken talked about. Health and vitality. Inner health, vitality is very important. Community, we have to be part of a community. And we need strong relationships. So we use this framework. Everybody who's doing the work that we work with is actually kind of working within this framework with families, with older people to foster these capabilities. And also what's very important is we have a measurement framework that measures these capabilities. Because otherwise we can say we're doing different work, but really if kind of at the top they're still kind of trying to count something different, it's impossible for us to work in those systems. And what's been really interesting with these measures over time is I've learned something that I should have known from all the reading and the work I've been doing, but I saw really clearly, which is that in the end it's the relationships that matter. I say it's like a kind of game of Jenga, that you can take out the other things, but if you take out the relationships, then things don't work. And by that I mean the culture of what we're providing, I mean what's measured, as I've said, but I also mean that what happens in that interaction between somebody who's by somebody's side to support them and the person who might be in that moment needing help. So this is a very, very different way of thinking about help, thinking about what's working, and what happens in that interaction. And I'm just going to read, how many minutes have I got left, Jakob? 2, 5, okay, so I just want to read something. I draw a lot on, I think it's really important that we draw a lot on different disciplines, and I love it when I come to Denmark because I meet sociologists, anthropologists, psychiatrists, but really there's an increasing kind of dominance of the economic discipline in the work that we do in England. And I draw a lot on psychoanalysis, on philosophy, and I really like this from the philosopher and psychoanalyst, Jonathan Lear, and he talks about help like this. He says, "To be truly kind, one needs to be able to distinguish a situation in which one ought to step in and help someone who is struggling from a superficially similar situation in which one should step back and allow the struggling person to develop the requisite skills and sense of autonomy. A kind person is sensitive to the difference, and in noticing that difference is motivated to act in appropriate ways. So in this approach, there is no way to specify in a particular set of circumstances what is the kind thing to do, independent of the judgment of the kind person. So this is a way of working without hard and fast rules. And when I first start to work in any city in Britain, or with any kind of department, it's a way which seems almost fantastical, because we no longer trust professionals. We don't allow them to work independently. In England, I don't know how it is in Denmark, teachers can't mark their pupils' exams, somebody else has to do it. Somebody else has to measure every professional in exactly the way that Ken talked about. We could draw parallels with social work, where thousands of children, 1 in 5 children under the age of 5 is seen by a social worker and put on a protection register in Britain, in part at least because the social workers don't have time to do that developmental work. So without the time and the space and the systemic conditions to kind of, if you're feeling stressed and you don't have resource, you can't be open and think, what is the judgment here? So we must just manage the risk and put the people on that risk register. But again and again, often in kind of almost impossible circumstances, like the families that we work with, I've seen how allowing the struggling person to define their own path whilst you're standing next to them to offer support leads to very radical change, and leads to change that is also sustained over time. So in the third part of the book, and what I was going to talk about, but I'm going to kind of squish it because we won't have time and maybe it can come in questions, is the question of transition. Everybody here is here because they're interested in new ideas and they want change, and I know that many of you are already doing this kind of work, but against the system. So the question is, how can we transition the system to kind of allow this kind of work, give it oxygen, give it room to grow and breathe? And so firstly, I think the most important thing is we have to start with what's abundant, not with where we see kind of scarcity. And I think 2 things are particularly abundant and have made all the difference to the work that I do. So the first thing is technology is abundant. And in the work I do, we use technology to invert the business model. Because with very simple available digital tools, we can provide the work we do to thousands of people. We use technology to take out that 80% of administration for the social workers. We use technology to create a youth service for all those young people that is basically not a youth service, it's knitting young people back into the communities. I haven't got time now to explain how it works. But it's very important that it includes every single young person, people who are thriving, who have relationships and connections they can bring, as well as those young people who are lost or struggling or in gangs or whatever. It costs £52 per person per year to run this, which is 2%. If we gave it to everybody in Britain, it'd be 2% of the budget we use on trying to kind of prop up children once they fall out of the system. And of course, it's possible. It would not be possible in the 1970s to work in this way because it would just be too expensive to organise the infrastructure. So although all the work is actually about face-to-face relationships, we use technology to take out the cost and provide in real time all the support that can facilitate those relationships. So that's abundance number one. And abundance number two is actually us, because we're many, we're highly educated, we're very motivated, we want to make change. But these industrial systems that we've inherited try to keep us out. They try to manage us at arm's length, they put us in the queue. And so often we go to places and we say, oh, this is the new way that we're supporting older people. And everybody is convinced. They're like, yes, that's fantastic, we can see you save money, we can see that everybody's doing better, but nobody's going to join here. And that's because I think the history of kind of working with these very vertical systems means that people don't want to join. Nobody wants to kind of join because maybe you're trying to save money, so now you've got to participate, or you can do something on the edge. But what we find is that when we design systems with people that are open and designed to kind of fit in with the grain of people's lives, everybody wants to join. Every single person we ask in our youth work, for instance, would you like to come and work with a young person? Every single person says yes. I think 98% or something of people, they're not paid, they just say yes. So we can kind of draw on that abundant relationship. I think there are actually three challenges to transition. The first is conceptual, actually. So how we do create the vision that I was talking about, and how we share that vision, and how we tell stories about it. And I think it doesn't have to be a service. One year here I met somebody who did hostmanship. Is anybody here from hostmanship? So this was this organisation in Sweden that just works to provide communities that are open in a very, not for anything particular, not for any problem, but just kind of open. And I think we can think in these ways. It doesn't have to be kind of a problem and then a service. The second challenge is organisational, because we can't push these new ways of working through traditional systems. And in my book, I talk about what happened, mistakes I've made when I've tried to scale and then push something through and how it all goes wrong. And then the third thing is really about the politics, because I think only politics can change the framework, and we need to have a different vision also of politics, and particularly political leadership. But the thing is, what I say in the book is that this work is happening all around us. It's growing everywhere. And what we need to do really is just think about how we can create these different structures, the kind of conceptual, the organisation, the political, that gives oxygen and begins to move that work which maybe looks a bit messy and nobody's funding and looks a bit strange around the margins to the centre. And then when we move that to the centre and we emphasise relationships, we see something just very radically different. Anyway, thank you very much.